Dead Rising 4. Half of you probably just rolled your eyes or even vomited at the sound of me even mentioning this being the fourth game in the franchise, and I'm sorry about that, but you knew this day was coming, and we're gonna have to rip that big old band-aid off because this is something that we need to talk about in order to finish this franchise up. At least until I make my review video on the new Dead Rising remake in September. Anyways, this game is widely considered to be the absolute worst game in the franchise. This project was extremely rushed. There were a lot of problems behind the scenes at Capcom Vancouver that caused this game to be as big of a mess as it was. That's why we're going to be talking about this today. It's a shame that I have to say Dead Rising and bad game in the same sentence because at first I really loved this game until I finished the story and never played it again. This was one of those games that is the worst example of locking your ending behind a paywall and completely pissing off your entire fan base. This game was released around Christmas time, December of 2016, and it was meant to be one of those Christmas-themed games like Batman Arkham Origins was, and it failed miserably. And it has a lot to do with the poor decision making over at Capcom Vancouver and the tension that started to brew after the release of Dead Rising 3. So let's take a walk and talk about the history behind Dead Rising 4. So after the release of Dead Rising 3, Capcom Vancouver wanted to move on to something other than Dead Rising, but Capcom wanted them to keep working on the Dead Rising franchise and would pretty much deny anything else that Capcom Vancouver would pitch to Capcom Japan. The game that Capcom Vancouver they were working prototype, and they worked on this with Microsoft. And when Capcom Japan would check in on the prototype, they were absolutely pissed because they wanted Dead Rising to stay like the other Dead Rising games. And since they were not consulted on this new direction, Capcom would immediately pull the plug on this prototype and force them to start over from scratch. Begrudgingly, all three companies thought it would be better for them to create a far safer sequel. Josh Bridge, the game director, figured the safest thing that they could do was bring back Frank West, put him in Willamette, and add combat mech suits as the new game feature. Vancouver also thought that rebooting the franchise would be the best thing to do because making franchise reboots were popular around this time, especially over at Capcom, and the team decided that they wanted a more grizzled take on Frank West, so they didn't bring back TJ Rotolo and instead casted Ty Olsson as the dude that sounds like Will Arnett. And this would be one of the first of many big mistakes for Dead Rising 4. Capcom Japan loved the idea of the mech suits, and they loved the idea of rebooting the franchise with Frank West. This would be another problem though. Because Capcom Vancouver had already spent all of this time and money working on this prototype, Capcom refused to give them any more money and any more time, and why the hell would they? Vancouver literally created a prototype of a game that wasn't approved, and it wasted all of that time and money. Even though this was Capcom Vancouver's fault, it ultimately made the fans suffer for something the developers did, and Microsoft at the time was not in any position to help them, as they had a lot of financial difficulties of their own at the time. A lot of this having to do with their exclusives that were launching very poorly. Vancouver would start working on this new game with the remaining budget and time that they had left, which was around 6 months to work on a new game. This also left them with about a year of production, which was a very little amount of time, and none of Project Climber could be reused, so they had to start over from scratch. And Capcom would actually fire a lot of the producers from Capcom Vancouver, which included Josh Bridge, because of the way they went about working on Dead Rising 4 and making an entire prototype without their knowledge, and this would raise a lot of tensions between the two companies. With Capcom firing Josh Bridge, this would leave the company with no strong leadership and actually put a lot of the other employees on high alert because they knew that the company's days were numbered. Those main producers that were fired were the guys working on Frank West's big return, and this would ultimately doom the game before it even had a chance to release. A lot of the staff started to see the writing on the wall and would start cleaning out some of their desks. 40% of the staff would leave the company before they could be terminated. The remaining staff figured that the game was going to be cancelled, and they started pitching ideas from other Capcom titles. Like, one of the ideas they had was a new Resident Evil title, which would have been an action spin-off of the most beloved franchise. This was denied because of the poor reception to Resident Evil 6. They would also pitch another entry into a long-forgotten game, Dino Crisis, but, of course, this didn't even get into the prototyping phase, as it was immediately denied. They would pitch 2 other games as well, one of them being a side-scrolling Mega Man game, but as you can guess, that was denied as well. With none of their ideas getting approved, the remaining staff would have to sit and work on Dead Rising 4, with the new lead game designer, Joe Nichols, stepping up to lead the project. This, however, was not enough to save the game, as the company was bleeding talent every month that Dead Rising dragged on. One of the main talents for the company was Annie Reed, who is a writer and actually worked on a lot of the Dead Rising games. Once she left, all of her work had to be rewritten by other people, which explains why the dialogue for this game was such a mess. With the budget of the game being so low and not having any time to work on it, a lot of the key features were either removed or outright simplified. One of these features were the psychopath boss fights, and this was because the team did not know how to implement them, so they were changed to maniac fights. A lot of this also had to do with the climate in 2015 and the struggles of mental health being different from what it once was. So many people saw the depiction of mental health being shown as a joke or cartoonish to be very offensive, and it really came down to the lack of time though. It would have taken a lot more time to introduce boss fights that would have been meaningful to the game. The camera feature would also see a big change, as the team wanted to implement the detective features that were big in games like Batman, which is an idea that could have had potential if it wasn't so janky and broken. One of the features that was cut and wasn't included in the game was the side story that had to do with following serial killers. This would have been aided by Frank's ability to discover clues at crime scenes with the help of his camera. And of course, the biggest feature of all to be removed was the timer. That was the most famous for all of the Dead Rising games, and before we talk about that, I just want to point out a mistake I made in my previous video where I said the timer was removed in Dead Rising 3. It was there, it was just so generous that to me it didn't feel like that much of a timer, but a lot of people pointed that out and I just wanted to correct myself on that. The timer in Dead Rising 4, however, was gone. It was completely non-existent until Frank Rising's DLC, which was the actual ending that was shat out after nobody played the game after a month. The creators say that this was removed so that players wouldn't have to feel the restriction of the time limit and they could spend more time killing zombies and exploring the map. This move was highly criticized by fans who have played the games throughout the years. With all of these features being cut, this prevented the staff from working on multiple endings for the game. Plus, there wasn't enough to do in Dead Rising 4 that would warrant multiple endings, and Microsoft would actually end up petitioning Capcom to grant the developers a few extra months to work on the game. But by this time, all they could really do was fix gameplay elements and polish what was already done. The Dead Rising team knew that this game was going to fail, and they weren't really in a position to say anything, so they kept plugging away on the game. Now, the big part that really ruined any chance this game had was, while this game was being worked on, another team had broken away and started prototyping a Dead Rising 5, which just leaves me with one question. Why the fuck did they do this? This has to be the dumbest thing that they could have possibly have done. especially when they knew that Dead Rising 4 was not going to do well. Never have I ever seen such a waste of time and resources from a company. These guys have to be one of the dumbest people on the planet to think that Dead Rising was even going to get a shot with what they put out with Dead Rising 4. Apparently, this is a common thing that most companies will do to avoid getting fired. If the team doesn't have a concept for another game lined up before the launch of the current project they are working on, then a lot of companies will just close the damn studio. At this point, you can tell that Capcom Vancouver's main goal at this point was to save their own jobs, which, for them getting fired, they fucking deserved this. They ruined what could have been a really good game, but instead, they just took every wrong move after time. You know, and this all could have really gone back to, how about let's not make a prototype for a new Dead Rising game without the approval of the parent company? That was the big problem here. Why? Why did they think that Dead Rising 5 was even going to be a question at this point? It just blows my mind. So, at this point, Dead Rising 4 would release December 16th, 2016, and as you can imagine, it did horrible. And I just want to briefly talk about the plot, because I know I don't even want to talk about this plot more than you guys want to hear about it, because it's the reason why this game is as hated as it actually is. But let's all collectively get our vomit buckets out and try to talk about this disaster of a story. Let's get into it. So the story takes place in September 2021, and it shows our hero, Frank West. He's teaching as a college professor. Frank is hanging out with one of his students, Vicky, who traps him to going to Willamette, thinking that they're going to go play mini golf, but they end up at a military base facility on the outskirts of Willamette. They go there and they find out that they are researching on zombies at this facility. They are eventually discovered and Frank and Vicky flee the facility. Vicky leaves Frank behind and he runs away, being declared a fugitive by the US government. 4 months later, he is found by Brad Park from the ZDC. You might remember Brad Park. He is one of the side characters from Dead Rising 3, and you can actually play as him in the DLC of Dead Rising 3. When he finds Frank, he tells him about another zombie outbreak that has occurred in Willamette, and he wants Frank to go with him to investigate it. In return, he'll get exclusive rights to the story. Frank agrees, and they head off to Willamette. They take a helicopter and are immediately shot down, and they crash in the mall. Upon arriving, they discover that the zombies are infected by a new strain of the virus, which makes them more aggressive. More aggressive than the normal zombies, which the Zombrex could cure the infection. But with these new zombies, Zombrex is ineffective against this. While exploring, Frank discovers that there is a new militia group called Obscurus, and these guys are in the city looking for a creature named Calder. Frank finds Vicky because they have opposing views. She refuses to work with him. Vicky also sells out some of the survivors in return for information, and this will come back to haunt her later. Frank is able to track down an Obscurus truck carrying Calder, but it drives off, leaving him to confront with an Obscurus lieutenant. Upon investigating Barnaby's lab later, he discovers that during his last days, he was trying to find a way to have a zombie retrain its human traits and intelligence. In case you don't know who Dr. Barnaby is, he is the man from Dead Rising 1 who was a part of the outbreak in Central America at Santa Cabeza. Now, before Dr. Barnaby was able to finish his research, he was lured to the mall in Willamette by Carlito Keys, where he eventually would die from the virus. After, Frank finds out that Calder used to be a soldier for Obscurus, who used an exosuit, but he was infected by these new kinds of bees in Barnaby's lab, which has turned him into the zombie hybrid human. But he was able to retain his memories and his intelligence. This zombie man is carrying around a disc that he downloaded from the lab and was carrying it around on his shoulder patch thing. Frank ends up having to take it from Calder. Frank later invades the base of Obscurus, faces the leader of the organization, Fontana, and the one responsible for shooting down his helicopter carrying him and Brad. Fontana reveals their group was not responsible for the outbreak. Instead, they were hired by an unknown client to obtain Calder's data, seeking to use the research on intelligent zombies to create a new, cheap labor force for factories and plantations in developing countries. Their confrontation is interrupted by Calder, who kills Fontana. After rescuing several survivors from a group of psychotic survivalists, Frank pursues Calder down to the sewers, where he steals the disc and transfers the data to his camera. Vic appears with a gun, forces Frank to give her his camera, and flees after destroying the disc. Frank runs after her all the way to the shopping mall, where they are intercepted by Calder, who destroys the camera, and the two have to work together to kill him. After the battle, Vic reveals to Frank that she took the camera's SD card containing all of the disc's data, and they reconcile, agreeing to share the credit for the story. Frank, Vic, and Brad, wherever Brad has been this whole time, leave to get to the rooftop to be abstracted by a helicopter, but a massive horde of zombies pursue them on their way there. Brad and Vic are able to make it to the helicopter, but Frank is grabbed as he is boarding, and he is unable to break free from their grip. So he sacrifices himself so Vic and Brad can escape. This ending will eventually lead to the paid DLC called Frank Rising. Like I mentioned before, this was one of the big reasons why people hated this game, because this was supposed to be the overtime mode. And I know I didn't really go into the specifics for the story like I normally do. I just wanted to briefly talk about it because it's not a very good story. Next, we're going to talk about Frank Rising. So, for this DLC, they brought back the timer, and it had multiple endings, which is something the original should have had, but I digress here. The story for Frank Rising, just in case watching this video didn't already give you Vietnam flashbacks, it gets even worse here. Frank, after falling from the helicopter, is half eaten by zombies, but suddenly all the zombies leave, and the experimental wasps infect Frank, turning him into a EVO zombie, if that's what it's called, converting him into an EVO zombie. This gives him the abilities like acid spit, pouncing, and roaring. After gaining all of these abilities, Frank begins eating humans as well as attacking zombies in the Willamette Mall. Frank is eventually shot and then taken to the safe house, where he is given control of his body back. He loses all of the zombie powers, but Dr. Blackburn, the obscure scientist who treats Frank, tells him that the military plans on firebombing Willamette, and the only way to survive is to get an evacuation helicopter, which will arrive shortly. I'm just gonna briefly talk about this DLC because it was so bad. So many people fucking hated this thing, but the DLC for this game brought back the timer that the game should have had, but I digress here. The story for Frank Rising, just in case watching the plot of this story didn't already give you PTSD, this is definitely gonna make you puke a little bit. Frank, after falling from the helicopter and being eaten by zombies, is suddenly turned into this mutated zombie. And it basically turned him into an EVO zombie. This gives him the ability like acid spit, pouncing, roaring. After gaining all of these abilities, Frank begins eating humans as well as zombies in the Willamette Mall. Frank is shot and taken to Barnaby's lab. Damn it. to the safe house, where he is given control of his body back, but he loses all of his powers because of the test that Dr. Blackburn has been using on him. She treats Frank and tells him that the military plans on firebombing Willamette, and the only way to survive is to get to the evacuation helicopter, which will arrive shortly. Blackburn also tells Frank that he could regain all of his powers by absorbing the wasp present in the EVO zombies. Frank will ask about a cure, which Blackburn agrees to help him with if he gathers all of the supplies for her. Blackburn will later double-cross Frank, but he threatens her into continuing to cooperate. Blackburn explains she needs to get into Barnaby's lab, but cannot due to the high levels of radiation. Frank is able to successfully be cured and turned back into a human, and is able to escape with Blackburn in the evacuation helicopter. If Frank does not collect all the special wasps during the game, Frank escapes alone with Blackburn and retires from journalism, spending the rest of his life in fear of becoming a zombie again. If he does, Hammond and her team escapes with them, and Frank becomes famous again, writing a book about his experience as a zombie that becomes a bestseller and exposes the government's involvement with Obscurus with the help of Vic. If the player runs out of time during the cases of the story, it ends in a failed rescue attempt due to the bombardment commanded by the United States government to prevent another zombie outbreak from spreading to the other states. And that's pretty much where the story ends for Dead Rising 4. Like I said, this was absolutely hated by everybody in the Dead Rising community for its boring, generic story, and because all the key features had been removed from the game entirely. I'm not even going to bother with fan reception because you guys pretty much understand what the main issues are with this game, but let's get into the next segment of the video, which is going to talk about the release of the game. So, Dead Rising 4 was released December 16th, 2016, and it was confirmed by Microsoft to be a timed exclusive, which meant it would release on PC after 10 days and it would stay on the Xbox One for at least a year, before eventually getting released on the PS4. And because of the hate this game received, not many people would buy it, and that would result in the poor sales. By April 17th, 2017, the game had sold less than 1 million units, which is no big surprise there. This would lead to the cancellation of Dead Rising 5 and the closure of Capcom Vancouver, which, again, no surprise there. If they had just communicated with Capcom Japan much sooner, then they might have been able to save the prototype that they originally started with for Dead Rising 4, but it just made Dead Rising 4 such a bad game. On January 30th, 2017, they would release a free download which included a harder difficulty pack, which would be hard mode and Black Friday mode, but without the key features from the normal series, the game would have nothing to gain at this point, and the player count would quickly drop. I mean, if you thought the Suicide Squad game was bad on launch, then you just completely missed Dead Rising 4 on your radar. There were massive bugs, glitches, crashing, and combine that with all the massive hate for the new Frank West voice actor, then you just have a recipe for a bad game. And honestly, that's all I really have to say. The gameplay itself is just so bad too. It just gets so boring after a while. There's nothing to do besides go around and collect collectibles, but even the combo weapons aren't even that good. And that was the whole thing they used to market the game with this. And I don't know, man. It's, in my opinion, like, Dead Rising 4 was just such a huge letdown for me. That's all I really have to say about the release, because there's no real numbers out there that I could find about how much money this game made. But considering that it did this bad, I can't imagine that they would share those numbers, because it's just embarrassing. But let's move on to should you play in 2024. So you pretty much already know what I'm going to say about this. This game is not worth your time. I'm sure you can buy it for super cheap. Actually, wait, I correct myself there because I actually just went back and checked this today. On PlayStation, it's $40 still, which is fucking crazy. Excuse my language, but this is insane. They're still charging $40 for this disaster of a game. And it's because they're bundling it up with all those updates that they released afterwards to try to give a reason to make it why. Like, it's $40 to buy this game. I had to buy this on the PlayStation 5 because I didn't have it on the PlayStation 5, and man, just to get this footage, I had to spend the $40, and I fucking hate that I did it, but it's too late at this point. If you're looking for a zombie sandbox game, it just isn't there. Killing zombies is fun, yes, but the combo weapons, I mean, I thought Dead Rising 3 had it really good in the sandbox department. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Dead Rising 3, it is a hell of a lot better than this game. This game is just, you get bored so quickly. You can't even get past maybe the first 2 cases before you get bored, and the character quips every 2 seconds make you feel like you're playing a superhero game rather than a Dead Rising game. And after a while, you wish Frank would just shut the hell up. The only thing I didn't mind about this game were the mech suits, where you could combine suits with like a slushy machine to make this snowsuit that would freeze zombies and kill them. I thought that was a lot of fun, and maybe if they had done it better, it would have been fun, but to me, not so much. There's also a lot of gameplay elements that I just could not stand, like the safe houses. They were scattered all over the place. There was no real survivor saving. Like, I watched one of the interviews that they did where they thought they actually did a play test, and people said that they didn't want the timer. And I don't know what Dead Rising fans played this game and said, man, I hate the timer, get rid of it. Because that was the biggest thing that people were so upset about when this game came out. So I don't know who those producers talked to, but they definitely were not fans from the original game. And they also said that they tried to take a lot of inspiration from what made the first game good. I feel like this entire game is just an example of not following the source material. I also think a lot of the stuff they said in interviews was just BS too. Like, I think they were just bullshitting their way through the interview because they knew this game was not going to be good. There are so many things that were going on behind the scenes that nobody really knew about until after the game released. And it kind of reminds me of the situation with the Callisto Protocol, where there were a lot of things going on behind the scenes that affected the overall development for the game, like time crunching, toxic work environment. And I feel like that these guys could have done something so much better with this if Capcom had been more, if there had been more communication with Capcom, and also if Vancouver hadn't gone behind Capcom Japan's back and tried to take the franchise into a new direction without the approval of the company who owns the damn license. That was just one of the dumbest mistakes that they could have made. And it affected the entire game, and honestly, it's the fans that really had to pay for their mistakes. Also, whose grand idea was it to recast TJ Rotolo? That man is Frank West. He has done such a good job over the years portraying Frank, and I feel like he could have done this so well. There was just, I don't know, I can't even begin to think why they thought recasting Frank would be a good idea, especially when there's so many fans from the older games. Even from off the record, he provided a more grizzled take on Frank, and it's just mind-blowing to me that they decided to go with this new guy, because this new guy just does not sound like Frank at all. It's just, It makes me so sad because there was so much potential with this game that was just wasted. And they knew this game was going to fail, and they just didn't care at this point. They knew their jobs were fucking done. That was it. And it's just so disappointing to me. But I don't know, it really grinds my gears. There are no redeeming qualities with this game, and I would have really loved to have seen what Project Climber could have turned into. Maybe we could have gotten a mix of this with Dead Rising 3, because even Dead Rising 3 was not a bad game. There were things I didn't like about Dead Rising 3. If they had just corrected those things from Dead Rising 3 and integrated it into Dead Rising 4, and without changing the voice actor, by the way, or picking somebody that sounds more like TJ Rotolo, but with a more grisly voice. But even TJ Rotolo could have pulled this off completely. So there's just so many different mistakes that went into making this game, and there was no saving it by the end, and it's extremely disappointing to me. I'm sorry about the rant there. I'm just super passionate about this franchise, and there's just so much potential with this franchise that this game itself, I've never seen a single game like Dead Rising, where literally everything can be used as a weapon. And they should have just continued from Dead Rising 3 the best way they could have done, which I feel like Project Climber could have been that change that the franchise needed. Not this game. Like Exo mech suits being the biggest new upgrade to the franchise, I feel like that was just heading in the wrong direction so quickly, and there's just so much that could have been done to save us from the game that we eventually ended up getting. So, my final thoughts on this game. Dead Rising 4 was the reason behind the cancellation of the entire franchise, and it also started because of a bunch of mistakes that started between Dead Rising 3 and Dead Rising 4, and the tensions that arose from Capcom Japan not allowing Capcom Vancouver to work on anything that was not Dead Rising. Maybe if Capcom had given them more leeway with the franchise, they basically helped build this franchise, and maybe we would have been able to see a Dead Rising 5 if it wasn't for these mistakes. We'll never really know the full extent of where this franchise could have gone. All we could really hope for is the success with the Dead Rising remake, and maybe this will reignite the franchise in a way that will allow for future installments of the franchise. I really like this franchise a lot, and I feel like it deserved much more than what it got, and hopefully we can see that change. I just want to say, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. According to YouTube, 97% of you that watch aren't subscribed to the channel, so please consider doing that if you like this video. I do plan on making future Dead Rising videos the closer we get to the release of the remake, but now it's time to move on to a different franchise. Let me know down in the comment section what you would like to see me do. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please watch another one, because that's how the algorithm works, and if you enjoyed this, maybe it'll recommend it to somebody else who does too. That's gonna do it though for tonight. I just want to thank you guys all for watching, and have a good night.